Which cards suffer and which cards benefit from the very first rotation? That is a question we're hoping to answer today. And right in front of me, I've got a tier list of all of the relevant cards that we'll be talking about today and how they place before the rotation. This is just more or less a reference point to sort of keep in mind what the power level of these cards are, as these are all of the cards that are important from Rocket through Gym that will be coming up through the Neo era. But yeah, we're going to be scrapping this tier list because so much is going to change, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So let's cut to that. So first and foremost, I want to talk about Erica's Jigglypuff and Erica's Dratini. Both of these cards are going to get a lot worse from where they are now, as they were top tier meta threats in their prime, and of course the base through gym format that we just came out of. But after rotation, they definitely get a lot worse, and for a couple reasons. Erica's Jigglypuff is much more obvious, as it's just the simple fact that without double colorless energy, it can't get those turn 1 KOs and turn 1 wins like it would in base through gym. On top of that, there are other cards in the format that sort of stop the insta win as a whole. Cards such as the babies or Focus Band do that. It's definitely not going to be staying in the S tier and is going to be moving down, I think, quite a bit, probably all the way down to C tier. It's still a card that I think can be played and could come up, but it's definitely not a card that we really have to worry about anymore, and more or less is something that has a niche in the format that there's not really any other card that does what it does, but there's also not really a deck that facilitates this sort of attack. So Erica's Jigglypuff is going to find its way comfortably into the C tier, whereas Erica's Dratini, the other S tier card from the original tier list, isn't going to have quite as good of a placement as Erica's Jigglypuff, because not only does it suffer from the double colorless loss, which makes it so that you can't use its attack consistently or as easily. It was mainly played not for its attack, for its ability, its Poke Power, and Base through Gym was a format dominated by basics, whether they had high HP or powerful attacks. Erica's Dratini was always a good counter to those big basics that would just sort of sit there and pummel through your Pokemon. Erica's Dratini forced the gameplay to slow down. However, in the Rocket On and Neo era, that really isn't the case. There aren't very many basic Pokemon that are worth playing, especially since we banned Rocket's Zapdos in the previous episode. So, Erica's Dratini really doesn't have a place in the meta, unfortunately. And whereas I can't say it's F tier because it's still a good tech if a basic deck ever comes up. I know Potpourri is still theoretically a thing, and this would be a good counter to a Potpourri deck, and probably the only counter that would really work against Potpourri, other than some sort of energy removal card, which we'll talk about later. But Argentini is going to find its way in the D tier as one of the worst cards to be jamming into your deck right now. On the other hand, Nightly Garbage Run, which was an A tier card, is still just as good as it was before the rotation. I don't really think it gets better or worse, as its niche is still the exact same. And as we lost trainers that, there weren't really any trainers before that helped you recycle cards from the discard. Just the fact that we lost so many good trainers means it's more likely that you're going to jam Nightly Garbage Run if you wouldn't have before. So it's going to be securing its spot in the A tier once again. I still don't think it's S tier just because it doesn't immediately net you advantage, which is something that I feel like is really important for the S tier. So A tier is going to be the perfect spot for Nightly garbage run. As for the stadiums, No Removal Gym was also in the A tier, I believe, and No Removal Gym is literally unplayable now, as its entire purpose was to counter energy removal and super energy removal, and since both those cards got rotated, this card is literally unplayable. The only reason you would jam No Removal Gym into a deck is if for some reason you didn't have access to any other stadium, but you needed a stadium counter to block off whatever your opponent was trying to do. And Narrow Gym, which was in the B or C tier, I believe, is sort of suffering from the same fate because Narrow Gym was also a card that was specifically designed to counter another card, which was Wigglytuff, which had to do the wave attack, which of course did more damage based on how many Pokemon you had on your bench. So Narrow Gym limited the damage cap of that deck. And it does also double as a healing option slash prize denial. So as far as that use, I think it's still pretty good, but it's definitely not as good because of the fact that since there's no Wigglytuff and there's no need to have there's not a deck that needs a huge deck. I don't think it's as useful. It's more or less going to be a tool for the prize denial, and I feel like there are other cards in the format that do a better job of prize denial, even though this is probably the only form that's guaranteed. Master Ball is another card that kind of stays in the same space that it was before, where there's no other cards that fill the same niche as it, and it doesn't get any better or worse, as whereas sure, a lot of the powerful Pokemon that you would have been searching for with Master Ball got rotated. There are new powerful Pokemon that you can search with it instead. So I think it'll find its way back in the B tier, I believe it was in. I honestly have, I have terrible memory. I don't remember what tier any of these cards were in, even though that was literally 30 seconds ago where I got rid of them. But Master Ball is going to be in the B tier, not the A tier, just because, again, you can't ever really guarantee the Pokemon you're going to find, or even guarantee that you'll find a Pokemon with Master Ball, as it is literally Great Ball from today's format, but it is still good enough to play in Rocket On, as there isn't a guaranteed way to search for anything, or at least for both basic and evolution Pokemon at the same time. In the same token, with searching, we have Good Manners. It does have some good competition in Pokemon March now. I'm not really sure which is better because Good Manners reveals your hand, but then at the same time, Pokemon March guarantees your opponent can find a basic Pokemon as well, and I think that you'd rather not have them set up. Good Manners also benefits from the fact that there are other cards in this format that rather there's so many cards in this format that let your opponent look at your hand that being the drawback of this card really isn't a big deal, and I feel like drawbacks is a theme with the Neo era. So as far as drawbacks go, Good Manners, it's not a bad drawback, and I think is a worthy B tier card. Moving on to some of the Pokemon here, Dark Vileplume is a card that never came up in our progression series, at least not so far. However, was infamously one of the best cards in the game, as it just shuts off your opponent's or both players' ability to play trainer cards. So obviously, once again, we're losing a lot of powerful trainer cards, but we are getting quite a few more. And throughout the Neo era, we'll just be getting more and more. The downside with Dark Vileplume is that it does have a somewhat high retreat cost, and there's no switching options available right away, at least outside of Warp Point, which we'll get to later. And it also has a very fragile body, as I believe it only has 70 HP, which is terrible for a stage 2. However, it does benefit from being a grass type, and Feraligatr is the top deck of the format, and if either one of us get the pulls to play it, then Dark Vileplume is kind of a good attacker as well. However, I do believe I'm the only one that has access to it. I think that Dark Vileplume is going to keep its spot in the A tier, not just because of everything I've mentioned, but also because Noctowl is a card that really affects the way rotation happens because Noctowl is such a format warping card. At least in a limited format, it is because I know Knocklock was a deck, but it kind of seems like in a limited format, there's no reason not to try to jam Noctowl. And Noctowl really pairs well with Dark Vileplume since Dark Vileplume makes it so your opponent can't play trainers. You can just use your Noctowls over and over again to make sure they just never have trainers in their hands. So even if they do get rid of Dark Vileplume, chances are it'll be too late and they'll not have any gas in their hand that they can use to try to regain the advantage that they had lost. Dark Dugtrio is a card that definitely gets better with rotation because Switch gets removed. I don't really know how playable it is. As I think Dark Dugtrio is a card that, whereas it can't really be jammed into just any deck, as a dedicated strategy, it can be pretty good. So I think it will land a spot in the B tier, but definitely the lowest card in the B tier. Finally, for the dark Pokemon, we have Dark Dragonair, which is a card we never saw come up in base through gym, despite it, being readily available for the 2 episodes it was legal, or the 3 episodes where it was legal rather. The real issue with Dark Dragonair in the pre-rotation uh, base through gym format is that there weren't really any decks that were running multiple lines of evolution Pokemon, and Dark Dragonair, that's its whole thing, is searching out evolution Pokemon. So if you don't have evolution Pokemon you're trying to grab, then why would you play this card? The exception to that was really only Wigglytuff, as it was the only dedicated strategy that revolved around an evolution Pokemon, but then all of its support Pokemon were basics. So unless you were really focused on a Wigglytuff Turbo build, there was no reason to jam this card in any deck. However, in post rotation, evolution cards and evolution strategies are everything, as all of the best Pokemon are stage 1s and stage 2s. So this sort of becomes the best search option for any deck, really, because I don't think there's a single deck in the Neo or the Rocket On format that revolves around basic Pokemon, other than maybe Sneasel, but that deck is so high rarity that it's unlikely that we will be playing it. So I think Dark Dragonair actually finds its way into the A tier as being a card that ridiculously good. I do think it's better than Dark Vileplume, maybe even better than Dark or than Nightly Garbage Yeah, Dark Dragonair is just crazy good in this format and we'll see a ton of play. And because Dark Dragonair will see a ton of play, the boss's way also gets a lot better. Just look at how high these dark Pokemon are compared to where they were before. Obviously, especially Dark Dragonair jumping from the D tier to the A tier, and the boss's way is going to find its way into the B tier right after Good Manners, as the boss's way essentially is really only going to be used to grab Dark Dragonair if you're playing an evolution line deck, or if you're playing a full dark deck, then obviously the boss's way is going to be at a much higher count, but otherwise you're really just using it to grab Dark Dragonair. As we mentioned before, Noctowl is a card that works very similarly to Rocket Sneak Attack. It's literally the same effect, except it's on a coin flip. However, setting a multiple Noctowl means you can essentially do multiple Rocket Sneak Attack in the same turn every turn. So Rocket Sneak Attack becomes worse kind of by default since we're bound to pull a number of Noctowls as it's just an uncommon. So Rocket Sneak Attack unfortunately gets a lot worse just because there's a card that's going to be available to us that does the exact same thing. So Rocket Sneak Attack is actually going to find its way into the C tier. At the top of C tier, just above Erica's Jigglypuff, because it's still definitely playable if we need filler space, but it's definitely not nearly as good as it was before. Brock is a card that was already in the D tier, but it just gets even worse after rotation because there are so many healing options available. Berry and Goldberry. that there's really no reason to play a card like Brock, especially because spread decks kind of get a lot worse as well, which I don't have that represented here on this list, but spread decks just don't do as well in Rocket On. I mean, they already weren't a very good strategy beforehand, but there was at least some ways to make it work, whereas now there's just too many cards that heal for spread decks to do good, and since there's not going to be spread decks, then you don't need to play as many heal cards, so it's sort of this whole psychological rock, paper, scissors situation going on, and because of that, Brock is going to find its way into the F tier, and it'll probably never see the light of day again. But speaking of gym leaders, Erica is one of the premier draw cards in this format, and despite the fact that it lets your opponent draw 3, it really doesn't matter because you're drawing 3 on your turn, whereas your opponent's drawing 3 also on your turn. So they don't get to take advantage of it right away, whereas you do. So say you Erica into your Knocked Owls, and now you can Knocked Owl away whatever trainers they potentially drew. So Erica, I believe, is probably one of, if not the best draw cards in the format, although I'm not sure that I would say it is A tier, just because we still have Professor Elm, which is a card that gets introduced to us in Neogenesis, but I think it definitely is a good draw supporter, so I will be putting it in the B tier, as since obviously it does help your opponent, even if it's something that they can't use right away, it still sucks to help your opponent, but Erica is, regardless, still a good card. Secret Mission is another one that's really good, uh, because it's kind of like the new Oak. If Erica's the new Bill, then Secret Mission is the new Oak because you can discard as many cards from your hand while looking at your opponent's hand and then draw the same number of cards that you discarded. So Secret Mission is really good for if you already have a big hand to keep the resources that you want while getting rid of the ones that you don't necessarily need to try to find what you do need in that situation. So Secret Mission is, I would say, just as good as Erica, if not maybe better. The only problem with Secret Mission is if you don't have an empty hand, or if you have an empty hand, you can't use Secret Mission. It's probably going to find itself in the mid B tier. Challenge is another card that is very similar to Bill. However, its downside is that your opponent gets to choose the effect that activates. It's either both players fill up their bench as much as they want, or you draw 2 cards. And the trick to this is getting your opponent to agree to you just drawing 2 cards, which can be quite difficult. And I feel like despite the format being balanced by all of the cards that basically state help your opponent win the game, part of the strategy of playing this format is ensuring that you minimize the amount of cards you have to play that are like that, or at least use them only when they would pivot you to your own path to victory. So, despite me initially thinking that challenge was the best option here, I think it's actually going to find itself in the C tier right after Rocket's sneak attack. Misty's Wrath, however, is crazy, also comparable to both Bill and Professor Oak in the sense that you get to look at 7, but you only get to keep 2 and the rest get discarded. Misty's Wrath is a phenomenal card, especially because Nightly Garbage Run is in the format, and it's also a staple in the Riptide for Alligator deck, which, if either of us pull, then this card is going to be crazy, but I think it will find its way into the A tier regardless. Now, one dark Pokemon I forgot to mention is Dark Muck. Dark Muck is a card that James used in the Rocket episode, actually, and Dark Muck has the Sticky Goo Pokepower, which makes it so that your opponent's retreat cost is 2 higher at all times. And in a format where there aren't very many switching options, that's a pretty good effect to have. Unfortunately, it itself has a high retreat cost, so all it takes is 1 double gust, and now you're stuck in the active and you have a hard time getting around it. So I do think it's a pretty good card, and I could see this coming up actually as a tech option. And the only reason why I wouldn't put it higher is because despite it not really coming up in that episode, just because I don't think, I don't remember if James was playing it or not, but the regular muck with the toxic gas ability, but that muck with the Pokepower toxic gas that shuts off other Pokepowers, with that card being gone, I don't think Dark Muck is as playable as its own deck, so it's more or less just tech that you can throw in. If the other Muck was still around, then this probably wouldn't even be in the conversation, though, as this is now not only the only Muck, but the most playable Muck. Blaine's Arcanine is another Pokemon that does get quite a bit better with rotation and the introduction of Neogenesis, as we get introduced to Metal Energy, which makes its first attack look a little bit nicer. It turns it into a 30 damage attack for 3 energy, but it also, with Metal Energy attached, it ensures that your Arcanine will be sticking around for a little bit longer. Plus, Typhlosion can power up its Firestorm attack consistently, which formed its own deck actually. So I think Blaine's Arcanine is going to find itself pretty high here on the charts. I don't know if it can be top of A tier just because Feraligatr is a deck that is likely going to be around in some capacity, but I'll put it in the A tier regardless, just as a close to the end of A tier, because it's still kind of a hard combo to pull off. Misty's Dugong is the other Pokemon from Base through Gym that benefits from Metal Energy, as its attack that does 60 damage for 1 water, 3 colorless, and does 20 to itself. With 1 metal energy, it now does 50 damage to your opponent, 0 damage to yourself, and you have all that room left over for other special energies you might want to use. And even though there aren't really any other good special energies to throw on there, other than maybe a potion energy, which we'll get to in a second, this card definitely looks pretty good and is probably the best non-metal metal attacker. So it is going to be at the top of B tier for sure. Now, with a water Pokemon like Misty's Dugong, you're going to be playing lots of water energy, and you're going to be playing Misty's Tears, which is the only way to search energy in this format, which is kind of surprising. I mean, obviously that changes later on. As of now, in just the Neogenesis episode, this will be the only way to search for energy and kind of ensure that water decks are the only playable decks. Being able to discard 1 to search for 2 is pretty crazy, and I would actually put this card in the A tier because of the fact that it just gets 2 water energy from deck, which not only deck thins out of cards you don't really want to draw, you can discard water energy with this as well if you have the Riptide Feraligatr deck, which is really cool. And speaking of energy, we have Dark Vaporeon, which is the last of the dark Pokemon, but a Pokemon that has an attack for, I believe, 2 water, 1 colorless, Whirlpool, which does 20 damage, and then you just remove 1 energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon and put it in the discard pile, which is really good, much stronger than it was before since the energy removal cards got rotated. This now makes it a pretty big threat. The only thing that gets in Dark Vaporeon's way is Recycle Energy and Eco Gym both get introduced, which are cards that basically just mean whenever an energy card is sent to the discard, it gets added back to the hand instead. So I still think this is pretty good and probably the best dark attacker outside of I mean, no, just in general, the best dark attacker that we have right now. Plus, the darkness energy does actually work on it. So I'm going to put it in the A tier, but at the very end of A tier, as I still think Dark Vileplume is better to have in your deck overall. Since Dark Vaporeon gets rid of the energy attached to your opponent's active, it's only right that we should talk about Potion Energy next. Potion Energy is a card that was the first special energy introduced after Double Colorless, making it the second ever special energy, alongside a couple others, but Potion Energy I like to think of as the second special energy introduced, as it kind of seems like a natural progression of things. It's colorless energy that has an effect, and that tends to be a theme that goes throughout most of the special energy that is introduced through the years of the Pokemon TCG. But Potion Energy just gets rid of 1 damage counter. I feel like even if it got rid of 2 damage counters, this card would be significantly better and would probably see a lot more play. Now, it's not completely unplayable like Brock, as even though Berry and Goldberry do exist, Potion Energy still has its place since there's still decks that really only need colorless energy, that they don't really need a specific energy type if you're mainly playing colorless Pokemon. However, it's still gone down a lot in its stock, so I think it'll find its way in the bottom of D tier. It's not completely unplayable, but it's really niche and, for the most part, isn't really going to accomplish anything. Rainbow Energy, on the other hand, I believe was in A tier before, at the top of A tier. And if you notice, we haven't put anything in S tier yet. And that's because, sure, we lost double colorless energy, but Rainbow Energy could never count as colorless. I mean, maybe it could have actually. I'm not really sure what the ruling is on that, but why would you want it to count as colorless? There's literally no reason for it to count as colorless, and there's no reason to attach this to a colorless Pokemon. However, with the introduction of Metal Pokemon, Metal Energy going alongside them, and Darkness Pokemon and Darkness Energy going alongside them, with both of those energy types being considered special energy and only being able to be played at 4, Rainbow Energy is the perfect supplement card for those strategies, as it counts as an additional copy of those. So you can now really justify playing a pure build if you get, 4 metal energy and 4 rainbow energy, or 4 darkness, 4 rainbow energy. Unfortunately, I only have 2 and James has none, so I don't really think James has the option to play a pure darkness or metal strategy, whereas I do because of this card. If I get lucky enough in my pulls to get metal energy and darkness energy in high enough quantities, then I'll be able to play realistically any deck I want in the Neo format. So for those reasons, I think Rainbow Energy secures itself as one of, if not the best card in the format. Energy Flow is another really important card in this format, as it really enables the Metal and Darkness strategies, as it lets you reattach special energy in a sense, since it returns any number of energy that you want from your field to your hand. So if you have a Pokemon that's about to get KO'd that has a darkness or metal energy attached, or even a rainbow energy, you can simply take it off with Energy Flow and reattach it somewhere else. However, it is a card that isn't really serviced by the fact that in its nature, in its own nature, it slows down the pace of your own gameplay, as you're missing an attachment for turn essentially, since you're losing energy on the field to simply reattach it somewhere else. It's also preventable through a double gust, and it's not really a perfect option for doing so. However, I still think that it is an A tier card if you're playing a deck that runs special energy. If you're not playing a deck that runs special energy, you simply wouldn't even consider it. But that sort of goes along the lines of cards like Blaine's Arcanine or Misty's Tears. It's a card where, in the situation where you would want to play it, it is the best card that you could possibly play. And I think for that reason, it deserves its spot where it is, almost dead center of the A tier. And we only got 2 cards left here. And we're going to go ahead and bring up Warp Point. Warp Point is a very interesting card, as Switch has rotated and Double Gust gets introduced, since Gust of Wind is also rotated. So Double Gust helps out both players, and since there's literally no other switching option available right now other than Warp Point has to be a super playable card, right? Well, it's kind of complicated, because with babies being in the format, Warp Point actually becomes less good of a card due to the babies, because the baby rule makes it so that you have to flip a coin in order to try to attack. So playing a Warp Point can oftentimes actually make it so that you're in a worse position than you were in beforehand. Like, sure, you can get your active Pokemon that's damaged or in a bad spot, out of the active and bring out something else, but chances are your opponent's just going to bring out their baby, and then if you miss the coin flip, they'll just be able to retreat and do what they were already doing before. So Warp Point still isn't a terrible card by any means, but it is going to find itself towards the bottom of C tier. Goop Gas Attack, however, is an absolutely crazy card because it shuts off an ability, or it shuts off abilities for not just your turn, but for your opponent's next turn. And there are so many powerful Poke Powers in the Neo format that really just warp the gameplay of the format. I mean, it's just an absolutely nutty card, and we lost the toxic gas muck as well. That's essentially what this is. It just lacks legs. However, in this situation, it's kind of a good thing that it lacks legs because unless your opponent's playing Dark Vileplume to shut off trainers, this card is absolutely amazing. It shuts off your opponent's Noctowls, shuts off their Feraligators, their Typhlosions, Meganiums, any of the decks that are really worth playing in this format, this card just nullifies. The hardest part of this card is you have to find the deck space for it because oftentimes you need cards to facilitate your own strategy in this format. Sometimes it makes it so that you can't leave available space for tech, but as far as tech goes, this is the best tech available and it is going to find itself at the bottom of the S tier. And that concludes our tier list breakdown. And this is how everything shapes up post rotation, at least in my opinion. If you have a different idea of how these cards would look post rotation, as far as their power level and their scaling, I would love to hear about it in the comments, or even post your own video. Or even if you think there's cards I missed out on here, or cards you think shouldn't even be on the list and are simply untiered, which was a tier I thought about including, but then I was like, well, I'd have to, if I had an untiered tier, then it would have to include every card that's not in the tier list already, and I just didn't really feel like doing that. But if you have any thoughts or opinions on this tier list, please let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear them and interact with you guys. But this is really fun to make, and I'm probably going to keep doing this every time there's a rotation or a significant shape up or shake up rather, in the meta. So let me know if you enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. And I will see you guys in the Neo Genesis episode. See ya.